I was 4 years old when my mother first placed a covering on my head. I do not remember the moment itself. I am told it happened on a Sunday morning, that I sat still while her hands worked the strings, that I did not fuss or pull at it the way some small children do. What I remember is the feeling of it afterward, the slight weight of the fabric, the way the strings hung against my jaw, the sense, even at 4, that something had been placed on me that meant something, that this was not simply clothing, that this small white cap was saying something about me to the world before I was old enough to say anything myself. I wore that covering every day for the next 19 years. And it was not until I was 23, sitting in a quiet room far from the community where I had grown up, that I finally asked myself honestly, did I ever truly understand what it meant? My name is Sarah. I grew up in a conservative Amish community in Indiana, and the story of the white cap, the prayer covering that every Amish woman and girl wears from early childhood, is not a simple story. It is a story about faith and identity and submission and womanhood and the particular weight of wearing something every day that carries more meaning than any single person put into it. Let me start with what the covering is, because I think most people from outside see it and assume they understand it. A white fabric cap, worn over the hair, tied under the chin with strings. Simple, plain, uniform, and in one sense it is all of those things. But the simplicity on the outside holds a great deal on the inside, the way still water holds depth that you cannot see from the surface. The theological foundation of the covering comes from Scripture, from the teaching that a woman should cover her head as a sign of her place in the order of creation. In our community, this was not treated as a suggestion or as a cultural relic from another era. It was treated as a living instruction, as relevant and binding on a Tuesday morning in Indiana as it had been when it was first written. The covering was obedience made visible. It was a woman's daily, physical, public act of saying, I accept my place in the order that God has established. I wear this not for fashion and not for tradition alone, but because I believe it is what faithfulness requires of me. That was what I was taught, and I believed it. I want to be clear about that. Not performed belief, not the belief of a child who has no alternative, but genuine faith in a framework that made sense to me inside the world I was living in. The covering connected me to something larger than myself, to every woman in my community who wore one, to my mother and her mother, and the long chain of women going back further than I could trace who had worn the same fabric expression of the same faith. There was real meaning in that continuity, real comfort in being part of something that did not change with every shifting wind of fashion or culture. But meaning is rarely only one thing. The covering also meant submission. That word has become almost impossible to use honestly because it carries so much weight from so many directions. People who use it to justify harm. People who reject it entirely as a relic of oppression. People on every side talking past each other. So, let me try to be precise about what submission meant inside the world I grew up in. It meant that a woman acknowledged a structure. God first, then the church, then the husband, then the household. It meant that her will was not the highest authority in her own life. It meant that the covering on her head was a daily reminder of this. Not a humiliation, but a reorientation. A physical practice of placing something above yourself. I lived inside that understanding for 19 years, and I will tell you honestly that it gave me things I valued. A sense of belonging to something larger than my own preferences. A framework that made decisions simpler. Not because the decisions did not matter, but because the framework provided a structure within which they could be made. A daily practice that connected the physical and the spiritual in a way that felt real and grounded. And I will also tell you what it cost. The covering was not optional. That is the thing I want to be precise about. It was not a choice I made each morning when I got dressed. It was simply what happened, as automatic and as non-negotiable as putting on shoes. The faith it represented was supposed to be genuine, and for much of my life it was. but the practice of it was not contingent on the genuineness of the feeling. You wore the covering whether you felt the faith beneath it or not. On the mornings when the faith was clear and warm and certain, the covering felt like an expression of something real. On the mornings when the faith was distant or complicated or absent, and those mornings came as they come to everyone, the covering felt like something else, like a statement being made about you that you had not been asked to authorize that day. I remember one particular morning. I was 19, going through a period of quiet doubt that I had not yet found the courage to name out loud, when I pinned my covering in place in front of the small dark window that served as my only mirror, and I looked at myself and thought, this covering says I believe certain things, and today I am not sure I believe them. And yet here I am wearing it anyway, and no one will know the difference. That gap between the inside and the outside, between what the covering declared and what I was actually feeling, was one of the loneliest things I have ever experienced. Not because anyone was unkind, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the covering was public and my doubt was private, and there was no sanctioned space in my community for the gap between them to exist. Doubt was something to be overcome, not expressed. The covering was always supposed to mean what it said. There is something else the covering meant that is less often talked about. It marked you. Not in a negative sense, in a literal, visible, social sense. When I walked into a store in town, when I sat in a doctor's waiting room, when I passed someone on the street, the covering announced something about me before I opened my mouth. It said, I am Amish. I am separate from you. I live by different rules. It created a kind of visibility that was also a kind of wall. People saw the covering and thought they understood something about me, and what they thought they understood was rarely the full truth. The covering simplified me in the eyes of strangers, reduced the complexity of who I was to a single legible symbol. I did not resent this exactly, but I noticed it. I noticed the way the covering made me a representative of something larger than myself in every public space I entered. I noticed the way I could not simply be a young woman buying flour. I was always also an Amish woman buying flour. The covering made the community present everywhere I went. Even alone, I was not entirely alone. When I was 23, I spent a period of time away from the community, and one morning, in a rented room with a real mirror on the wall, I looked at myself without the covering for the first time as an adult. Just my hair and my face, and no white fabric declaring anything about me to anyone. I looked at that reflection for a long time, and what I felt was not liberation exactly. It was something more disorienting than that. A kind of blankness, as though a constant low hum I had been so accustomed to that I had stopped hearing it had suddenly gone silent. The covering had been saying something about me every day of my life. Without it, I did not yet know what I was saying instead. It took me a long time to find the words for that. I am still finding some of them. What I understand now that I did not understand at 4 or 19 or even 23 is that the things we wear every day, the coverings both literal and figurative that we put on before we face the world, are never simple. They carry the meaning we believe in, and the meaning we have inherited, and the meaning others assign to them, and the gap between all three. They connect us, and they constrain us, and sometimes they protect us, and sometimes they hide us. And understanding what you are wearing, and why, and whether it still fits the person you are becoming, that is some of the most important work a person can do. I want to ask you something tonight. Is there something you wear, not on your body necessarily, but in the way you present yourself, the way you move through the world, that was placed on you before you were old enough to choose it? Something that has meant so many different things over the years that you are no longer entirely sure what it means now? And if you could choose today, freely, honestly, without anyone watching, would you still put it on? I think about that every morning. I think I always will.